from here, we will inshallah do a drive for them as well. But at this time, that's not a possibility. We also have our election commissioner sitting there doing a membership drive. If you are not a registered member of ICF yet, please register yourself. This year is an election year at ICF. In November, there are going to be elections, and if you are not registered, you will not be able to vote. So make sure that you stop by in the back and register with Brother Noman Shafi, who is at the back of the hall. And also, Masjid really needs your support for operations and construction. And for us to run the masjid effectively, the best thing that can happen is that you sign up for recurring donations at the masjid. It helps us understand our budget better, and we know exactly how much we can spend. So if you could sign up for recurring donations, $20, $25, $30 a month, anything, it's really helpful to know how much money is coming in on a consistent basis in the masjid. So we would really appreciate that. Jazakallah khair.
If we may ask the brothers, inshallah, to come this side.
Yeah, all my brothers to my left, please come on this side so our sisters can come downstairs and can enjoy the program, inshallah. And I would request the sisters to come downstairs. Brothers are making a space for you.
How are you? Is it associate professor or associate professor? Associate, right? How are you? Salah, nice having you.
Thank you so much.
Of course, of course.
Nice to meet you. My name is Asad.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Doctor, are you ready to start?
We just have to hook up the.
To connect, that's it, right?
Yeah,
So, I'll just have the brothers come here, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Brothers, if you don't mind, please, if you can, I know you're gonna hate me because I'm asking you to get away from the wall. Yeah, if you don't mind, if you can just, inshallah, come closer here. If you can come, inshallah, this brothers on the side, if you can sit here, inshallah, to make it easy for the speaker, instead of looking all the way there. Assalamu alaikum. We just need to settle down, inshallah, Rabbil Alameen, settle down so we can start the program.
Assalamu alaikum, brothers. May I request you to please come forward. If you want to socialize, you can step outside. But if you want to listen to the lecture, please come inside. Come closer. Brothers at the back. My brothers in the back, can you please come forward? Brothers on this side, can you move a little bit more here so we can move the divider and the sisters can have a better view of the lecture, inshallah. All the boys and girls 13 and above, you can head to the second floor, inshallah, to meet with Ustada Sophia Khan. Sheikh Mubin is also up there. All of our youngsters 13 and above, please head to the second floor.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين اللهم اجعل جمعنا هذا جمعا مرحوما وتفرقنا من بعده تفرقا معصوما ولا تجعل فينا ولا منا ولا بيننا شقيا ولا محروما اللهم آمين يا رب العالمين. أما بعد, we're honored to have Dr. Jamillah, alhamdulillah, and to welcome the brothers and sisters who made it today for such an important event to understand about the black history. Subhanallah, there is nobody can deny the efforts, subhanallah, that the brothers and sisters who came to the US, mashallah, and how much of impact, mashallah, they left, and the legacy that they left, mashallah, over here. And we thought in the Islamic Center Frisco, since we're inclusive, alhamdulillah, for everybody, and we welcome everyone in our masjid, alhamdulillah, brothers and sisters. We thought of putting this program together. I would like to thank Sister Amal and the Sister Committee, Sister Zainab, Sister Bushra, and Brother Asfar, and everyone. I do not forget anybody, but Sister Committee, mashallah, they've been working together to put this amazing program together. And you have no idea, Dr. Jamillah, I think we scheduled you like what, 3-4 months ago or something? So she has scheduled, mashallah, like 3 or 4 months ago, I remember. So Jazakallah khairan, thanks so much, it's an honor to have you. And without any further ado, inshallah, we're going to start the program with Dr. Jamillah. Dr. Jamillah Karim is an award-winning author and speaker specializing in race, gender, and Islam in America. She is a former associate professor in the Department of Religious Studies at Spelman College and holds a BC in electrical engineer and a Ph.D. in Islamic Studies from Duke University. Dr. Jamillah is the author of American Muslim Women and co-author of Women of the Nation Between Black Protest and Sunni Islam. Also, mashallah, she has a number of books. They are available, mashallah, over here in the lobby. They're going to be in the main lobby area here for purchase, inshallah. She is going to sign the books and you can buy them from the lobby program. Brothers and sisters, join me in welcoming Dr. Jamillah Karim. Dr. Jamillah, thank you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Allahumma salli wa sallam ala Sayyidina Muhammad. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for that generous introduction.
Are you going to stand? Are you going to be walking around?
Not necessarily, no, because I have to advance the slides, so. I'd like to echo the Amir's gratitude to all those, particularly Sister Emma, who organized this, and thank you all for being here. I'd like to thank the Shura of the Islamic Center for having me. So I thought that we would start off, inshallah, with a little Black History Month quiz. So, who is the man in the red shirt? Okay, I heard some sisters saying Muhammad Ali. And what about the man in the sunglasses? Not even the Black people here? Okay, so that's a trick question. That's a trick question. You wouldn't know who that is, but my sons would. Any of you would like to offer the answer to who that is in the sunglasses? Yes, it's their grandfather, it's my father. So that wasn't totally fair. Okay, so we had the microphones. Okay, so, and you can see my father seems a little bit more serious about the photo than Muhammad Ali does. Okay, the next one, with a show of hands, so without speaking, but a show of hands, who gave Muhammad Ali his name? Is it A, raise your hand, those who say A? Okay, those who say B, raise your hand. Okay, nobody thinks. And what about C? Okay, great. So the answer is A. The man who gave Muhammad Ali his name was A, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. Muhammad Ali came to Islam through an organization called the Nation of Islam, and the leader of the Nation of Islam was a man originally from Sandersville, Georgia, with the name Elijah Poole. But today he is written down in history as the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. The next question, who founded the Nation of Islam in 1930? Again, just a show of hands. A, as who founded the Nation of Islam. Okay, A, okay, B. Okay, B, all right, and then what about C? Okay, C. Okay, so Elijah Muhammad was the leader of the nation, but he was not the founder. In fact, the founder of the Nation of Islam was B. So those who answered B, you were right. And his name is Farad Muhammad. Now, by show of hands, how many people say that he looks Desi? Which means from the Indian subcontinent, but I think most of y'all know that. Does he look Desi? Okay. Anybody think he looks Arab or white? He looks Turkish? Okay. But one thing we know is that he's not of African descent. So why would an immigrant from the East who is not Black bring a made-up version of Islam to Black people in America? To understand this requires some knowledge of a concept called Black religion. And I'm not talking about Christianity, even though Black people in America are mostly Christian. Black religion is a term that academic scholars of religion use to describe how African Americans have used religion as a source of liberation or a tool of liberation. When enslaved Africans, some of whom were Muslim, were forced to convert to Christianity, they were taught that they were the inferior race and it was their divine destiny to be slaves. Naturally, enslaved people resisted this idea, but at the same time, they held onto the Bible, the only scripture that was available to them. And this meant teaching Christianity in ways that uplifted Black people. Of course, enslavers could not allow for religion to be used to inspire resistance. And so, Black preaching was actually made illegal in many states. Here's an example of a law in Georgia. No person of color shall be allowed to preach, to exhort, or join in any religious exercise without or with any persons of color, either free or slave, there being more than 7 persons of color present. And we also see an image where there is a Black preacher, however, the enslaver and his family are there to monitor. But our ancestors resisted anyway. A former enslaved woman reported, "We had our own church in the brickyard way out in the field. We hid behind the bricks and had church every night." Black religion continued and thrived post-slavery. So what happened when black religion met a religion called Islam? When a black liberation leader learned of a religion in the East, in the lands from which our ancestors were brought? Well, black religion's Christian elements are simply replaced with Islamic elements. And this kind of transfer of black religion from Christianity to Islam is captured in the images here. The one on the left is a Christian service, and the one on the right is something different but intriguing. At the same time, the resemblance between the two black worship spaces is striking. The lively expression of the preacher and also the prominence of women are both features of black religion. But what's different about the image on the right? Well, the Eastern Muslim-looking dress of the worshipers. So let's zoom in. The first leader to appropriate Islamic or Muslim symbols for the purpose of black liberation was this man called Noble Drew Ali. Originally given the name Timothy Drew, he was born in Tennessee and later migrated to Newark, New Jersey, where he founded in 1913 a religious organization called the Moorish Science Temple, later reestablished in Chicago in 1919. Keep in mind that in 1920, black people were called at best Negro or colored. The name African American was unheard of at this time, as was the concept that black was beautiful. Noble Drew Ali used Muslim names, terms, and dress to refashion the identity of black people as the superior race, undoing the racism of white people. Noble Drew Ali proclaimed that black people were Moorish Americans, the descendants of an ancient people who inhabited the region known today as Morocco. He radically changed their racial identity, calling them Asiatics, and he defined Asiatic broadly to comprise all ethnicities who were not European. So in other words, Noble Drew Ali used Asiatic in the way that we would use people of color today. He declared, "We are returning the church and Christianity back to the European nations, while we, the Moorish Americans, are returning to Islam, which was founded by our forefathers for our earthly and divine salvation." Therefore, Noble Drew Ali was the first to proclaim that Islam was the original religion of black people. Noble Drew Ali's teachings to psychologically and economically uplift black people were published in a pamphlet alongside passages from the Quran, the Bible, and quotes by black nationalist leaders. And he called the medley of sayings, you can guess, he called it the Holy Quran. Even though this was not the real Quran, of course, Noble Drew Ali was the first to introduce elements of Islam into a culture that was highly receptive to the foreign faith. When people joined his organization, they actually received nationality cards, which declared, "You are a Muslim under the divine law of the Holy Quran of Mecca. Love, truth, peace, freedom, and justice." Okay, let me go. And it also said, "I am a citizen of the United States of America." The way that Noble Drew Ali successfully reimagined American citizenship for blacks was, or with an identity that was altogether different from the one forced upon them by white people, is clearly captured in the dress of these Moorish American men standing out in an urban setting. The Moorish Science Temple boasted a membership close to 10,000 in Chicago, with temples cropping up throughout the Midwest, the Northeast, the Mid-Atlantic, and even in the South. However, this quasi-Islamic movement was soon overshadowed by another, the Nation of Islam. The dominance of the Nation of Islam cannot be overstated. People are still converting to Islam today because of the autobiography of Malcolm X. The Nation of Islam's impact was so dominant and pervasive because Allah would choose it to be the primary means by which countless black Americans would come to know the true Holy Quran, which leads us to this photo. So So let's review. The name of the man in the life-size portrait is Farad Muhammad, who I introduced earlier as the founder of the Nation of Islam. We also know the name of the man who is sitting down, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. But we have yet to introduce the man standing next to Elijah Muhammad. Who is he? And you can go ahead and name who he is. Imam Wardi Muhammad, may Allah have mercy on him. Both Farad Muhammad and Imam W.D. Muhammad are holding the Mus'haf, or the written Quran. So what is the meaning here? We're going to come back to that question. Let's return to this man, Wallace Farad Muhammad. Earlier I asked, why would this man, who's not even black, create a version of Islam to attract black people? Well, now we can answer that he did so within the larger context of black religion as a tool of liberation. But again, this man wasn't even black, like Noble Drew Ali. Several historians have suggested that he was Desi. Some believe that he had ties to the Indian missionary group known as the Ahmadiyya, Allahu Alam, but that would explain his interest in designing a religion to appeal to African Americans. The Ahmadiyya sent Mufti Muhammad Sadiq, their first missionary to the United States in 1919, exactly the time when Noble Drew Ali was teaching black Americans their original religion. The Ahmadi missionaries in America quickly discovered that African Americans were dramatically more interested in Islam than whites. The Ahmadis began to take cue from black religion and would tell people, change your name and you won't be a Negro anymore. It has been said that the converts who came to Islam through the Ahmadis were the first African Americans to learn and practice Salat. So, was the founder of the Nation of Islam an Ahmadi? We don't have the evidence to say, but we do know that Farad Muhammad's teachings were aligned with the ethos of black religion. It's almost as though he picked up where Noble Drew Ali left off, and like the Ahmadis, Farad realized that black Americans were much more receptive to his message than white folks. Farad introduced himself to Detroit's African American migrant community in 1930 as a peddler of various goods. Soon after gaining the confidence of his customers, he began to censure Christianity and the black church. Farad taught his customers that Islam was their true and natural religion, and that the Asiatic black man was the God of the universe, subhanAllah, and that Caucasians were blue-eyed devils created by an evil scientist, Yaqub. Farad's audience grew rapidly in size. They were comprised of predominantly working-class migrants from the South who found their dreams of economic opportunity unfulfilled. After gaining a substantial following, however, Farad disappeared in 1933, never to be seen again by his followers. And this is the reason that his true identity escapes us. Elijah Poole, who had migrated to Detroit from Georgia, became a foremost follower of Farad. And shortly before his disappearance in 1933, he gave Elijah the name Muhammad, along with 2 copies of the Quran, one with the Arabic text only, and the other with both the Arabic and English translation, which Farad followed with this instruction: learn Arabic. This is the greatest evidence that we have that Farad Muhammad designed his teachings with the sincere intention that they would eventually bring black Americans to Islam, affirmed by this photo presenting Elijah Muhammad, and particularly Imam Wardi Muhammad, who was holding the Mus'haf, as the ones chosen to deliver the intended message, ultimately that of the Quran. The Honorable Elijah Muhammad is the man who would tangibly prove that the black man's true religion was the key to freedom, justice, and equality. He once proclaimed, "We must remember that the fault is not in the slave master anymore. Since he says you can go free, and we say today he is hindering us, it is we who are hindering ourselves. He can't hold you a slave now. You are holding yourself a slave."
He taught that the true freedom for Black people lay within themselves through two means. First, the foundation of clean living that Farad Muhammad first established. Farad expected his followers to immediately give up pork, drinking, smoking, and dating. He even made fasting and, of course, prayer services a steady part of their regimen. Between 1930 and 1933, Farad Muhammad laid the foundation for discipline and Black excellence. Elijah Muhammad was the man who spent the next 4 decades building the nation. He created a highly organized structure to ensure that the Muslim lifestyle was maintained, otherwise members would be expelled. Next to the clean living, the second means through which Black people would be truly free was economic independence. Elijah Muhammad taught African Americans to be financially independent of whites and the government by producing their own jobs, pooling their resources, and sustaining a separate, self-sustained community. Do for self was his motto. Between 1934 and 1975, over 78 Nation of Islam temples were established in urban centers across the nation. Almost every nation temple had a school, restaurant, and real estate. By 1975, Elijah Muhammad's nation included 15,000 acres of farmland, a newspaper with an estimated circulation of 500,000, several aircraft, a fish importing business, restaurants, bakeries, and supermarkets, as well as a plan for a 300-bed hospital. By the time of his death, Elijah Muhammad, originally from a poor family in Georgia, had amassed a fortune estimated at $25 million. The public image of the Nation of Islam was clean-shaven Black men in suits and bow ties selling the Muhammad Speaks newspaper. The women, noticed because of their long garments and hair coverings, stood as beacons of purity and piety. Due to these stunning images of Black men and women, alongside the outstanding economic, educational, and media enterprises the nation brought to poor urban communities, and due to the charismatic personalities of Malcolm X, Muhammad Ali, and Louis Farrakhan, Islam came to be forever associated with Black power, freedom, and justice. Okay, another quiz question. Which masjid states on its website that it is recognized as the first mosque in the in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex? Okay, so again, by show of hands, those who say A, the Islamic Association of North Texas. Okay, I think I understand. And B, Masjid al-Islam, Dallas, Texas. Okay. And so the answer is B. Masjid al-Islam is considered to be the first masjid in the area because it was originally a Nation of Islam temple, temple number 48, established in the 1950s. In fact, there were at least 3 temple number 48s established in the area, including this one in Fort Worth. And in my research or my preparation, I came across a video of a Black reporter interviewing members of the temple. Okay, let's go back. So when exactly did these temples become masjids where salat was established and the Quran was recited? Well, this is our favorite part of the story. And it's the part of the story that most of you are familiar with, but inshallah, I'm going to broaden it some for you. It is the story of the transition from the Nation of Islam to Al-Islam. And by the way, African American Muslims with roots in the Nation of Islam often use the term al-Islam with the definite article al, as in Masjid al-Islam, to differentiate between the Nation of Islam and true Islam. Most of you know the story of the transition to al-Islam from the autobiography of Malcolm X. As you know, Allah decided that Malcolm X would return to him in 1965, and the Nation of Islam continued strong for 10 years. Although his autobiography has brought countless people to Islam till this day, it was Imam Waridin Muhammad whom Allah chose to deliver to his people the Quran. which takes us back to this photo. Imam W.D. Muhammad assumed leadership of the Nation of Islam upon the death of his father in 1975, and he immediately taught from the Quran and corrected the teachings of Farad Muhammad and his father. I think that one of the best sections in my co-authored book, Women of the Nation, is when I describe Imam Wardi Muhammad's journey with the Quran, his challenging nation teachings, the community's accepting his new leadership, and how he strategically moved away from his father and Farad's teachings, but never disrespected the two leaders. Imam Muhammad was an exceptional, or he was exceptional in two ways, or he was exceptional that he was both a predecessor and a successor of Malcolm X in a sense. Both of them were expelled from the Nation of Islam in 1964, the year that Imam Muhammad, then Wallace, began to publicly oppose his father's teachings. In the autobiography, Malcolm X describes Wallace as Elijah Muhammad's most strongly spiritual son. So I call him a predecessor of Malcolm X because Wallace had already been studying al-Islam. He read the Quran from cover to cover as early as 1963. And in the chapter Mecca in the autobiography, Malcolm X stated that he turned to Wallace when his inner thoughts nudged him to learn more about Islam. He wrote that Wallace had told him, yes, a Muslim should seek to learn all that he could about Islam. I had always had a high opinion of Wallace Muhammad's opinion. Of course, formally, Wallace Muhammad succeeded his father, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, but you could say that he was a successor to Malcolm X in the sense that he was able to carry out, by Allah's decree, what Malcolm was not, and that was, again, bringing al-Islam to the masses. And when I say the masses, I mean the Nation of Islam community, whose membership grew to 1 million Muslims by 1975, of which 250,000 were active. Throughout history, whole tribes and cities have converted to Islam at once. In America, Allah chose Black Americans for our nation's mass conversion to Islam, and Imam Muhammad as our leader. In the first year of the transition, Imam Muhammad invited whites to join his following. He instructed his community to participate in the Ramadan fast and 5 daily prayers. By 1977, Imam Muhammad had changed the name of the group to the World Community of Al-Islam in the West. He redesignated temples as mosques and then as masjids, and ministers became imams. Imam Muhammad made his first Hajj in 1967, 2 years after Malcolm X. In 1977, exactly 10 years later, he led a group of community members on their first Hajj. One sister shared this in her timeline about a year ago. It reads, reminder, this was before cell phone cameras. At that time, Saudis would confiscate cameras during rites of Hajj. Thank Allah for this airplane shot on the way to Mecca, 1977. Hajjis led by Imam Wardi Muhammad. I appreciate Sister Aisha's noting the preciousness of the photo in the context of the time that it was taken. Similarly, we can appreciate the excellence and blessing of Imam Wardi Muhammad, or we could not appreciate it without accounting for the time period in which he carried out his remarkable work. Imam Muhammad literally walked a whole generation through this faith in a time before the internet, before the floods of books and Islamic literacy in this country. The new Muslims, especially in the beginning, were at his mercy and guidance. In 1975, they fasted their first Ramadan. It was in September. And he told them that every day in Ramadan, they had to read a juz of the Quran, so that by the completion of the month, they would have completed the entire Quran. And of course, they were reading the Quran in English with understanding. I grew up with this expectation as well. And it wasn't until I went to college and was around other Muslims that it dawned on me that this was not an obligation. But Imam Muhammad made it one for us because he wanted us to understand the Quran for ourselves and to have an intimate relationship with God's book. And outside of Ramadan, of course, he encourages us to read the Quran on a daily basis. Most African American Muslims in my parents' generation, all converts, have read the Quran in its entirety with understanding countless times. And for this reason, it's just crazy for me to hear that there's a stereotype about black Muslims that we don't know our religion. And this is where I'm going to move into my first book, which is, it's a look at race relations in the American Ummah, and I focus on African American and South Asian Muslims. And when I was doing my research in Chicago in 2002, this is 20 years ago, this is how a new convert described this stereotype to me. This stereotype that immigrants have about African Americans. They are not really Muslims. They are not practicing the way they are supposed to. They are not covering completely. They are just American. They are not the real thing. That seems to be the strange consensus of Arabs and Pakistanis towards American Muslims. Unless they are dressed exactly the same way they are, or speak Arabic, or know the entire Quran, they are not really Muslims. What explains the striking contrast between the stereotype and the reality of a community of people who regularly read the meaning of the Book of Allah and who study it? Let's go back to this picture. Of course, I would never expect any of you to identify my father, but the whole exercise that we did in the beginning, it presents this question. How is it that we can so easily and eagerly identify with Muhammad Ali or Malcolm X, but we don't know the people in general who have been living this legacy of the black experience in Islam? And it is a divinely favored experience. And if I haven't already imparted that, this is why. We know that people of all races or ethnicities have converted to Islam in America. That's the beauty of Islam, and it's proof. But Allah favored the black community with an affinity for Islam. And Allah made a substantial part of that community converts to Islam. And this is unique to black Americans and to the United States, because in no other Western country is there a native-born group of people, a native-born group of converts associated with Islam. So, when you think of Islam, you actually think of this ethnic group. But Allah made this for black people in America. It is as though Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, here you are. For all the pain that your ancestors suffered, that you still suffer, here is a gift for you. In 2017, I wrote a pretty passionate message to my Arab and Desi peers. I had just watched a documentary about James Baldwin, and it inspired me. It was in Black History Month. And this was part of what I wrote. And don't think that because you love Muhammad Ali and read the autobiography of Malcolm X, it means that you are down with my people or connected to the struggle. Rather, it means that Allah has chosen white and immigrant Muslims to be leaders in recognizing what has been done to black people in this country. That it is your moral duty to be brother and sister with black people. And that God has given you an advantage in the fight for and with black people by putting love for Ali and Malcolm in your hearts. That God has given you an advantage in this fight. And so this is a primary point in my first book, again, which focuses on race relations. South Asian immigrant Muslims have an advantage in the fight against racism in this country, a fight that requires solidarity and real relationships with black people. Their advantage is that the people with whom they share a religious identity, the people who make up a considerable part of the Ummah in America, are not white people, but black. But this is the dilemma. South Asian immigrants are not aspiring to be associated with black people. In fact, immigrants from the Indian subcontinent are among the most successful, in terms of wealth, education, and integration into white neighborhoods. But here's the thing. No immigrant is trying to be around black people. Cultural critic Vijay Prashad, also a South Asian, wrote, "Since blackness is reviled in the United States, why would an immigrant of whatever skin color, that means black, want to associate with those who are racially oppressed, particularly when the transit into the United States promises the dream of gold and glory?" And then I wrote in my book, Prashad's question strikes at the very heart of this book. When Muslim immigrants come to the United States, they also pursue the American dream. What does it mean then for them to find that a substantial part of their new ummah is America's racially oppressed? Their shared place in the American Muslim community almost forces South Asian Muslim immigrants to agree to some affiliation with Muslim African Americans and vice versa. Islam's emphasis on religious sisterhood and brotherhood, reinforced through its rituals of communal prayer and pilgrimage, also encourages this association. So I basically argue that the concept of the ummah, the concept of Muslim unity, that it brings African American and immigrant Muslims together, even if just temporarily, in certain moments, maybe like in this one, making the American ummah one of the most promising sites of black and immigrant unity in the country. Indeed, this concept does move some Muslim immigrants to fight the tendency to see blacks as inferior. However, Muslim immigrants moved by the ideal of Muslim unity are more the exception than the rule. Because when you ask an African American what it means to share the ummah with immigrant Muslims, you are more likely to get responses like this. And this was 20 years ago, but I think it's still relevant today. A woman said, you're already being beaten down, torn down, discriminated by the white majority. Now here comes this beautiful way of life, Islam. You see this as being the only solution to your problems. Yet you have a group of people that follow the same belief system, or they profess they follow the same system, and yet they are discriminating against you. You have already been trying to belong, and now they're telling you, we don't like you either. So we already know that racism is just plain wrong. But if we needed any further incentive to help us not be complicit in it, and let me say this, it is very hard to not be complicit in anti-black racism in this country, to not participate in it in some way, because it is so systemic. Our nation is built on it. But it is possible to resist. You just have to be very intentional about it. So as I was saying, if you need any more incentive to fight racism, know this, that our prejudices and stereotypes or ignorance, they are actually turning away people within our very own ummah. And that's one of the things that I found out most unexpectedly in my research in my second book, Women of the Nation. First, to give some background, Minister Farrakhan, he followed Imam Wardi Muhammad into al-Islam in 1975, but then he turned back to the teachings of the nation 2 years later in 1977. He resurrected the Nation of Islam. So for the book, I interviewed women who are currently in the nation. This was in 2012. And I asked, why is the Nation of Islam still relevant to you? I mean, when my mother joined the nation in 1971, it was before the internet. It was even before, most immigrant masjids came up. In a sense, my mother didn't really know, she didn't have any other kind of access to Islam. But now black people know that Islam is this universal religion. How can you, knowing that, and in a post-11 context, I mean, obviously Islam in its broad dimension is right in front of you. So when I asked this question, I received, one answer from the woman I received was that they like the Nation of Islam because of its focus on the black community, its focus on uplifting African Americans still. But another answer that I received, and it was a recurring one, was that it was because of the treatment that they suffer in immigrant masjids. And one sister described how a newcomer to Islam who is black feels when attending an immigrant masjid. She said, nobody's going to speak to me. Nobody's going to say, how are you doing? Assalamu alaikum. Nobody's going to connect with me at all. And the kind of subtle racism, I see that. But I'm trying to come into Islam, and I don't want to feel like I'm less than anybody else. But with the teachings of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, you're not going to feel like you're less than anything. First, I have to really stop and say, like, what's going on when she says no one's going to say Assalamu alaikum? Like, no one's going to say Assalamu alaikum in the masjid. I wrote in the book, after I shared that passage, I wrote, as we saw earlier, Khalila left Sunni Islam, another woman. She left Sunni Islam. She did the reverse of what Malcolm X and Imam Wardi Muhammad did. She left Sunni Islam for the nation because of the ill treatment at a masjid. And so I just write, I write about, well, you know, it's interesting though, because this is really the purpose of the Wardi Muhammad Masjid though. Like, you can come to the Wardi Muhammad Masjid because it's basically the, you know, black masjid, and you should feel welcome there. And I mentioned that too, that Imam Muhammad was very careful about protecting us from immigrant influence. And so I want to talk a little bit about that, just another important feature of his leadership, and it also kind of gives background to a story that I want to end with from my first book, American Muslim Women. And so so Imam Muhammad, he promoted a positive attitude towards American citizenship. The Nation of Islam was separatist, but now with the change in direction, Imam Muhammad taught that the only way we can be successful as Muslims in this country is to be integrated into society. He encouraged his community to participate in 4th of July celebrations in 1977, the same time that he placed the American flag on the cover of the community newspaper. And I would say this is probably where he and Malcolm X would differ. But it really shows Imam Muhammad's wisdom, as we'll see in a minute. So what does this have to do with African American immigrants? This pro-American stance extended into many realms of being a Muslim. So one simple example is that Imam Muhammad taught us that it's okay to dress like an American as long as our dress is modest. By doing this, Imam Wardi Muhammad was protecting his community from a developing phenomenon in the 1960s or 70s and 80s, and that was what Sherman Jackson was the first to really extensively write about, a phenomenon called immigrant Islam. How many people are familiar with Sherman Jackson and this concept, immigrant Islam? Basically, immigrant Islam is the way that immigrants assert cultural and religious authority over American convert Muslims. Let me also take the time to note here that what we also have something that we call the early Sunni African American groups in the 1930s and 40s and thereafter. So that there were some African American groups, again, not as dominant, that were outside of the Nation of Islam. Again, they weren't as popular as the nation, but they did exist, and you probably will come across some African American Muslims who will tell you, I never was in the Nation of Islam. Many of them had contact with the Ahmadis. Karim Abdul-Jabbar is an example of that. But these black Muslims who were not in the Nation of Islam, they were more vulnerable to this thing called immigrant Islam. And even to really help capture what immigrant Islam is, I think it's helpful to go back to that quote that I read where the sister was saying that, black Muslims are not seen as really Muslims, when she says there seems to be this strange consensus that you're not the real thing unless you dress exactly the same way they dress or speak how they speak. Like that's this idea of immigrant Islam. So there's been this tendency among Arab and South Asians to present authentic or real Islam as an expression of Islam that looks Arab or South Asian. So literally there's an expectation that you dress like us, you look like us, maybe even think like us. And many African Americans surrendered to immigrant religious authority, and they basically kind of gave up their African American identity for this immigrant identity. In other words, to be Muslim even meant to reject being American culturally. And so Imam Muhammad was very intentional and proactive about the harm of immigrant Islam because of what he observed about immigrant Muslims when he first began interacting with them in 1960. And I'm going to read a quote where he says, I felt comfortable around them, but as I began to hear more and more what they were saying, I began to feel uncomfortable because I could hear them responding to hurt, denial, rejection, and oppression that they blamed the West for. And as I heard that, I began to hear something that I couldn't accept as being Islam. I began to wonder how much difference there was between African Americans who feel victimized in the Muslim world and between African Americans who feel victimized and the Muslim world that also feel victimized. I'm going to go down to the bottom of the quote where he says, we're hoping for a time when we can kind of heal enough emotionally so that we can really see the pure light of this religion. So he kind of saw this, like, again, this blame that immigrant Muslims were putting on the West for, the Muslims' problems. And again, this is against the backdrop of colonialism, so a lot of it is definitely understood, but he saw this kind of frustration and anger. Ironically, immigrant Muslims moved here to pursue the American dream, but immigrant leadership, including popular white imams, taught us to reject Western identity and culture. And so I just quoted Imam saying that, he hopes it's a time that we can heal. That really didn't begin to happen in a very dramatic way for immigrant Muslims until 9/11. I wrote in my book, American Muslim Women, American Muslim Women, how, okay, I'll just quote. I wrote about the way that they began to have this kind of wake-up call. Fearing hate crimes, many South Asian Muslims responded to 9/11 with eager displays of patriotism. As one second-generation of Arab Muslims in Chicago observed, it immediately became apparent in the immigrant community that any orifice that was available had an American flag stuck into it. The masjid had towering American flags all over the place. So the point is that there was like this just dramatic push to show that we're American. And guess what? African Americans didn't have to do that because one, we weren't really targeted. We weren't experiencing the kind of anti-immigrant Muslim discrimination post 9/11. But another thing was that we don't really have flags in front of our masjids, but Imam Muhammad put the flag on the paper in 1977. So it was like, in a sense, we had already had that wake-up call in 1975. So before 9/11 happened, Imam Muhammad had received, he received a lot of criticism for his fairly patriotic stance from both immigrant Muslims and African American Muslims, who are obviously the ones who were not in his community. I just want to share a quote that of Imam Muhammad's, another quote, to give you an idea of his view on this. He said, if we want to get the full benefit of citizenship in this country like whites, we will have to identify as citizens of America with this land and with the traditional excellence of its people. It's really interesting. He really focused on the excellence, the goodness of Americans and white people and the government. We must show genuine, sincere interest in making a positive, healthy contribution to this land as citizens, working side by side with others who share the same idea or concern. I'm obligated by God's expectations. Okay, so yes, I was just kind of used to the kind of criticism, but not until I went to college. Again, I grew up in the community. I just went to a Black Masjid in Warri Muhammad community. When I went to college at Duke University, that was my first interaction in MSAs with children of immigrants, South Asian Arabs mostly. And I never forget, because Imam Muhammad used to come to Duke often. They would invite, he would come often to speak, and the other students couldn't understand, like, why are we inviting Imam Muhammad? Like, why aren't we inviting, I don't know, Imam Siraj, or I don't know, but they were just really surprised. And I remember one young brother told me what the problem with Imam Muhammad was, and he said, it's because he puts more of America into Islam than Islam into America. But again, the point is that I was already kind of accustomed to this criticism. So I want to end with a story in my first book where I had met a woman. She was a college student. So today, she's probably 40 years old. And she was working at the Inner City Muslim Action Network in Chicago, so doing work in the inner city with Muslims. And she graciously invited me to her home, and the South Asian women were very welcoming of me, and I had many meals in women's homes. I interviewed them, and we had this wonderful conversation between her mom and me and her. But I want to first mention something that happened. I'll go back to the conversation. That during dinner, the father made some really mean remarks about Imam Wardi Muhammad. And I can't even remember the details of them. And even though I was accustomed to it, I think it really stung this time because I think it really hurt because here it is that this family invited me into their home as their Muslim sister. But you don't really even know me. And I don't really mean like personally know me, but I mean that you don't really know enough about the Black community to consider that there's a 75% chance that this young African-American woman that you're serving as a guest grew up in the Wardi Muhammad community. And we're in Chicago, right? We're in the hometown of Imam Muhammad. We're literally where Imam Muhammad stood in 1975 and proclaimed, La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. So the fact that he didn't even consider that, that I was in the community, that I would be greatly offended, And I think maybe part of the bitterness of the moment too was that I didn't really speak up, I didn't defend Imam Muhammad. I didn't tell him, that I'm a member of this community. So that happened, but another thing that happened, and this is really what the book is about, is bringing attention to these, these realities, these difficult realities still in our communities, but also this hope. And the hope comes in from the conversation with the daughter earlier before the dinner. And we were just talking, and we were talking about how they used to go to Chicago public schools, and then they started to go to universal and Islamic schools. So she was explaining, the mother explaining why they left the public schools, and she's mentioned, once my kids were beaten, they got beaten by some Black kids. And I think I first said something like, wow, I'm sure it's not just Black kids who are doing that. And I just immediately kind of noticed it was a stereotype, and I think I did say something. And then the daughter, the mom had to step out right at that moment. And then the daughter shared this with me. And she said, it's weird because I never feel that way. And she said, I would never think to associate that, meaning beating up on kids, with a certain ethnicity. And if anything, actually, I would associate that more with white suburban kids who had a deeper undercurrent of meanness. I wore hijab in junior high, so I know exactly how kids treat other kids that they thought were different. They made their life miserable. You were ridiculed. It wasn't just kind of ha, you're so fat. No, it was mean, not allowing them to sit down or pulling their hair, just meanness that I've never seen in any other community. And as Nasreen spoke, her voice grew irate, as if she was releasing suppressed anger from childhood. People say, why are Black people so violent? Well, I'm thinking, why are white people so violent? White serial killers, the Ku Klux Klan, lynching and slavery, she said, just enumerating the acts of violence and speaking more and more emphatically as she continued. Segregation, Jim Crow laws, if that wasn't violence, what was? And so I really appreciated her eloquent statement of connection with African Americans. And it was coming from a sincere place, her own sense of hurt from white supremacy in this country. And she was actually doing the work to resist, because again, I met her at the Iman office in the inner city. And I also learned her struggle, right? I understood what it meant to go to a public school as a Desi. I never thought about that, for two reasons. One, I'm African American, but also I went to Muslim school all my life. And actually that's what I want to end with is one final quiz question. Someone can just answer it. What woman from Black history homeschooled her children when it was illegal to do so? And someone can just say her name. Yeah, Sister Clara Muhammad. Sister Clara Muhammad. So, I gotta lift up the women. That's what my books are about. By the way, the books are for men too. It's broadly about the communities, but the point was that we don't hear about women's voices. We don't hear women's voices. Women are not seen as sources of knowledge, so that was kind of the point of focusing on women. So this is what I had to share about Sister Clara Muhammad. She was the wife of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. She played a significant role in founding the nation, But she also stirred the nation to create an alternative to the public school, and that was they called it the University of Islam. The University of Islam they gave the lofty name University of Islam, but they were actually primary, secondary schools. And it had its beginnings in the home of Sister Clara Muhammad. She and her husband withdrew their children from the public schools in 1934, a time when homeschooling was illegal. Elijah Muhammad was fined and arrested. Clara Muhammad never returned her children to public school despite harassment by law enforcement. It's reported that she told the police at her door, "I will die as dead as the door, not before I allow my children to attend public school." And this required enormous courage and faith in God, especially for a woman from the Jim Crow South who either witnessed or heard firsthand of the brutality and violence inflicted upon African Americans who resisted white supremacy. In 1980, Imam Mufti Muhammad renamed the University of Islam in honor of his mother. And as a graduate of the Spelman Muhammad School, and as a homeschooling mother, I am indebted to Sister Clara Muhammad for her faith, resilience, and sacrifice. Imam Muhammad's Quran journey finally relates to her starting this independent school. When Imam Muhammad talks about how he came to the Universal Islam, he often mentions a Palestinian brother named Jamillah Karim. I might be saying his name wrong, but he was hired by Elijah Muhammad to teach Arabic in the University of Islam. And so Imam Muhammad has said that this Palestinian teacher, he never would teach against the NOI theology, but according to Imam Muhammad, he would have private conversations with him. And he would try it in a very clever way, just make him kind of think logically and encourage him to read the Quran. And so Imam Muhammad once said, when he was talking about the impact of this teacher on his rejecting his father's teachings, he said, it was Diab's influence, and especially the Arabic. Arabic was the key, I think. And so do you remember Farad's, they actually call him Master Farad's instruction to Elijah Muhammad? What did he give him? He gave him the Qurans, and he told him to learn Arabic. So, alhamdulillah, jazakumullah khair. So I know I took a lot of time, but I said, I'm not often able to do this, so I took the time. But if you have questions, then we have space for, time for a couple of questions. Yes. MashaAllah.
Yeah, Jazakallah, thank you so much for this session. I want to maybe relate an incident as well as then ask a question to you. Pre-COVID, I used to travel a lot, and whichever city I used to go, I would go to a masjid for the prayers or for the Jummah prayers specifically. I traveled once to Philadelphia. I went to a downtown masjid, which was like almost 90% of the people there were African Americans. The imam and the way they used to preach and the Friday sermon was like very entertaining, very interactive compared to like what I have observed in the DFW area. No prejudice, nothing against that. But it was a different experience for me. And probably they identified me as someone different. They asked me to stop after the Jummah prayers.
They asked you for what?
They asked me to stay back after the Jummah prayers. And the imam, he asked me to share the lunch with him. And that was a wonderful experience. It was a very humbling experience for me as well, and interacting with them. They were African Americans from different African country origins. The food I tasted was very different. So the point which you had raised in the description of your book, as well as the prejudice typically the South Asians, the Indian subcontinent have against the African American Muslims. One point which is they bring along a baggage. I am an immigrant as well from India. So we not only bring along the baggage of how we view other people, but also the food becomes an important part of the baggage. We look for food, we look for dresses, we look for a community which is bad and good as well. So in that sense, I have a question to ask. You find the challenges and the prejudices which are there. What's your advice, and what's to kind of blur the boundaries, have people interacting among different communities more, and then like feel like one, rather than like having pockets of cultural centers within the masjid, within the Islamic community, which is totally against what Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned, specifically also in his last sermon, in his last Jummah sermon, when he said an Arab is no different than a non-Arab in Islam. So what's your suggestions? How do we come across this bias? How do we overcome this bias and prejudice?
Yeah. Thank you for your sharing and your question. So there are lots of things that we can do. One thing that we're doing right now is having this conversation, and a lot of it is about small steps, right? There are so many ways to resist anti-Black racism. I want to say, too, that in the book, I focus more, again, on systemic racism rather than the prejudices that immigrant Muslims already have. And I know that's part of it, but my larger point in the book is to really bring attention to this long-standing system of racism in this country, and the ways that immigrants are kind of they begin to participate in it just by the mere fact of being here, right? And so, educating yourself about African American Muslim or African American period struggle through literature, I think, is an excellent way to really kind of understand and empathize with the experiences of African Americans. And so this is what I mean, that it can be, something as small as that, but it's huge as, deciding that I'm going to read Black literature, this percentage of the time. We know the hadith that, none of you truly believes until you love for your brother or sister what you love for yourself, right? So there has to be this, genuine love for one another. So I would say that we should definitely seek that approach in really creating those bonds. So, being together with each other, inviting each other over for dinner. And interestingly, visiting a masjid like you did, that even in taking those small steps, you're actually resisting these larger structures of racism, because the racism in this country is very much, one aspect of it is very residential, right? The way that, when Black people move into a neighborhood, whites will move out of the neighborhood. Like I already mentioned, how, when immigrants come to this country, they're not trying to live in Black neighborhoods. So what are the ways that we can, begin to disrupt that? I mentioned the Inner City Muslim Action Network and Imam Rami Nashashibi. So in the book, you'll see he was quite passionate and radical. He would want immigrants to move to the south side of Chicago. That's what he actually lives in the south side of Chicago. So he suggested that you kind of make those kind of moves. But I realize that's quite radical, and I get it. I mean, I lived in Malaysia for a year. And one thing I appreciate about living in Malaysia was I could better understand immigrants and their choice to live, with what was most comfortable for them, right? Because I wanted to make sure I lived in the nicer areas. I wanted to live with the expats, So I kind of I was better able to understand that. So that being said, I think that it doesn't even have to be as radical as, I'm going to move to a Black neighborhood, obviously, or even send my child to a Black school. But I think that, again, those are some of the approaches to actually creating those bonds, to getting to know each other, Yeah, I mean, even marriage even comes up in the book. And there are some people who feel that that's the way that we should come together. And I think, that happens naturally, alhamdulillah. And again, I'm not trying to enforce that upon people. And lastly, I'll say I do think that there's a natural part of being with your own group. And that's what the Quran says, that Allah says that He created us in tribes and nations so that we can come to know each other. The tafsir is that, one tafsir is that it's really saying that we can actually to be able to identify ourselves differently, to recognize that we are different. But again, it's coming together, So there's a way to kind of balance that, of wanting to be with the culture that you feel comfortable with, but also trying to intentionally resist some of the systemic racism in this country. Okay, any other questions?
Dr. Jamillah, Jazakallah Khair for this amazing lecture and educating us about not just the black history, but also the confusion of the women and what their role was. And to brother's point, I think that's a good segue into going into the lobby, that Dr. Jamillah is here with both of her books tonight. She will be outside in the lobby, and if you really want to learn about what the black history means to us and how the African American Muslims here paved the way for us immigrant Muslims to be able to openly practice our religion, Islam, here, I think you need to go get those books tonight from Dr. Jamillah. She will be there, she will sign them for you. I would highly encourage you to do that.
Thank you so much, inshallah.
And I don't want to keep you away from the food for too long. We have biryani tonight. I would request the sisters to head to the second floor. But again, let me remind you, Dr. Jamillah will be in the lobby. So even if you head out to eat, come back, get your books from downstairs, inshallah. And don't forget our brother Noman there. He is signing up for the memberships. If you want to vote in the election this year, please sign up for the ICF membership in the back. Jazakallah khair for staying up till now tonight. Assalamu alaikum.